A River of Tears is a Maclean's article published July 7, 2017, under the title A Battle is Exploding in Our City, is the inspiration for this case study. On May 2, 2018, CBC posted the article, Search for Thunder Bay Police Chief Could Attract Motivated Reformers. Both articles share commonalities in their content. One is that since 2000, 7 Indigenous children have been pulled dead from Thunder Bay waterways. The other is to what extent systemic racism impedes the Thunder Bay police force when dealing with these cases, all of which further contribute to the marginalization of Indigenous peoples. Case overview. The article used for this case study can be summarized in the following quote. The search begins in Thunder Bay for a new police chief after outgoing chief J.P. Levesque announced his retirement on April 26 of this year, and as the force and its civilian oversight board remain under the microscope over allegations of systemic racism, particularly against the city's Indigenous community. There are currently 2 high-profile investigations looking into the conduct of the service and the board. These inquests are looking into the allegations of systemic racism and the way the force treats the deaths of Indigenous peoples. Historic factors. There are many interlocking historic powers at work in Thunder Bay that are continuing and creating barriers between its police force and Indigenous population. What started out as cooperation and coexistence between Aboriginal nations and settlers in earlier times gave way in the 19th century to a process of Indigenous displacement and assimilation. As the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples noted, the Canadian state wanted to pursue an economic development program increasingly incompatible with the rights of and ways of Aboriginal peoples. These processes of displacement and assimilation were not only justified by a belief system that judged Aboriginal people to be inferior, but enforced by law. Under the Constitution Act of 1867, Aboriginal people became not citizens but wards of the state, when the federal government obtained plenary jurisdiction over Indians and reserves. The federal government replaced traditional models of governance with the Indian Act. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission points out that the Indian Act represented a denial of sovereignty, self-government, and autonomy. The Canadian state more or less engaged in a policy of cultural genocide and used legislature to do it. Policies made it legal to claim traditional lands, send children to residential schools, delegitimize women's roles in their communities, and much more. All of this has resulted in lower socioeconomic conditions and poorer lifestyles that Aboriginal people face in society today. Social and political factors. Indigenous people are at a great disadvantage in today's society. Not only has past policies left the majority in poor socioeconomic conditions, but the Canadian society around them today is largely Eurocentric. Any institution in existence, such as academia, Western medicine, business, and even the legal justice system, are all rooted in European colonial powers of the past, powers that deem Aboriginal people to be inferior and in the way of economic gain. And today it is apparent with the lack of Indigenous recognition or representation in school curriculums, economic models, and the justice system that their culture, traditions, and lives are still inferior. Currently, Aboriginal populations are faced with poor levels of education, health, employment, and incomes. The Indian problem, which was said by the 1879 Indian Affairs Minister, Duncan Campbell Scott, carries breadth in today's situation. Back then, the Indian problem was that Aboriginal people inhabited land that Canada wanted to exploit and was therefore in the way of economic gain. Today, there's a societal viewpoint that the Indian problem now is that Aboriginal people are a strain on federal resources and taxpayer dollars and holding Canada back in terms of economic gain. Those perceptions may contribute to the victimization of Aboriginal people. According to data from a general social survey on victimization, the overall violent victimization rate, including crimes such as physical assault, sexual assault, and robbery, was double the rate than that of non-Aboriginal people. And Statistics Canada revealed that 1/3 of hate crimes directed at Indigenous people in Canada in 2015 occurred in Thunder Bay. As Maclean's puts it, Thunder Bay is a small town with big city crime and social dysfunction. It is a place where the results of Canada's mistreatment of Indigenous people are coming home to roost. The intergenerational effects of residential schools, cyclical poverty, and addictions, but with fewer supports. Thunder Bay is the largest city in northwest Ontario, and many northern First Nations communities travel there for resources such as healthcare and education. It is one of Ontario's least diverse cities, with a population that is 90% white, with a growing Indigenous community that now makes up 88% of the population. The news and media have highlighted the city's hostile atmosphere and treatment towards Indigenous populations. 7 children, all of them Indigenous, have been pulled dead from Thunder Bay waterways since 2000. Most of these children came from northern communities, and the members noted that they grew up swimming and became strong swimmers. According to Maclean's, in 2014, an Indigenous man was hospitalized after being hit by a brick thrown from a passing truck. A 17-year-old girl from a northern Ojibwe community was yelled at several times to go home, and another 13-year-old girl was called a dirty Indian. Actions and words send a message to Aboriginal people that they are inferior still and unwelcomed. The Thunder Bay Police, like the population around them, have little exposure to Indigenous culture and lack an understanding of the history. One policeman wrote a letter that said, "Natives are killing natives, and it's the white man's fault the natives are drunk on the street, and it's the white man's fault the natives are homeless. Well, let's stop giving the natives money and see how that goes." CBC reported that an Aboriginal girl filed a formal complaint against the Thunder Bay Police, stating that she was subject to a street check that left her frightened and under threat. It seems like Thunder Bay and its police force are still quite far away from being culturally sensitive by today's standards. The Thunder Bay Police Force and its Civilian Oversight Board still remain under the microscope over allegations of systemic racism. Several Indigenous children were pulled dead from Thunder Bay waterways, and still the police marked many of the cases as unsuspicious or non-criminal. And that seems to happen very often with Indigenous cases. Indigenous people are worried about their safety in Thunder Bay, and they cannot even look to the police to protect them. There are currently 2 high-profile investigations looking into the conduct of the Thunder Bay Police Service and its Civilian Oversight Board. One is the Ontario Independent Police Review Director's Probe, which is expected to be made public by the end of this summer. This inquiry is looking into Thunder Bay Police Service practices as they relate to Indigenous death and missing person investigations. And the other is Senator Murray Sinclair's investigation on the Ontario Civilian Police Commission. This investigation was initiated by a variety of serious concerns about police board governance in Thunder Bay. Its mandate is not to investigate the Thunder Bay Police Service, rather the manner in which the service is being governed, directed, and held accountable by the board. Sinclair's interim report has been completed, and the final report is expected August 31st, 2018. And in the meantime, the force has said it is committed to change to make the force and board more culturally sensitive. It took a long time for issues in Thunder Bay to be seen as legitimate and in need of investigation. The problem is not isolated to Thunder Bay or even Canada alone. All around the world, there are Indigenous nations that are and were affected by colonization. Indigenous people around the world share the commonalities of governmental mistreatment and policies without reference to their rights. As of 2007, the United Nations adopted the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Though this declaration is not yet implemented in Canadian law, courts have long held that international standards are relevant to the interpretation of domestic laws in cases of doubt. So in a way, the Declaration may have an important impact in the direction of Canadian law. It's an interesting debate whether Thunder Bay's treatment of its Indigenous people is a violation of rights by international standards. Even closer to home, however, a case could be made that the force in Thunder Bay is failing to abide to Section 15.1 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. This section states that every individual is equal before and under the law and has the right to equal protection and equal benefit of the law, without discrimination, and in particular, without discrimination based on race, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, sex, age, or mental or physical disability. As mentioned before, Indigenous people do not feel safe or protected in Thunder Bay, despite the fact that the law states that every individual has the right to equal protection and equal benefit of the law. The Truth and Reconciliation Committee of Commission of Canada notes that if Canada is to transform its relationship with Aboriginal peoples, Canadians must understand and respect First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples' own concepts of reconciliation. Many of these concepts are found in Indigenous law. Section 718.2e of the Criminal Code may begin to foster relationships between Aboriginals and the legal justice system, as it involves a much greater understanding of Indigenous history. Section 718.2e provides sanctions other than imprisonment should be considered, especially in the case of Aboriginal offenders. In 2012, the court noted that a sentencing judge is under a statutory duty to consider the circumstances of Aboriginal offenders under this section, and that a failure to do so constitutes an error of law. An example of other sanctions besides imprisonment is the use of restorative or circle justice. Restorative justice seeks healing in contrast of punishment. It is a way of addressing conflict and crime that enables the person who caused the harm, people who were affected by the harm, and the community to create a meaningful solution. Thunder Bay could take this a step further and use restorative justice between the family subject to cursory investigations of loved ones and the investigating officers. It already has the programs to do so, as the restorative justice management is just based out of Thunder Bay. But is reconciliation possible in Thunder Bay? Looking back at the case study article, Thunder Bay was looking for a new police chief, hoping that a motivated reformer could fill the job. But the article also notes that no matter how progressive the successful candidate is, he or she will find it impossible to single-handedly bring about a cultural change without the support of other officers and the Police Services Board. Maybe this process has already started. On the Thunder Bay Police Service site, there's a section called Breaking Barriers, where the force will provide updates on the efforts it is now making to address concerns of systemic racism and systemic barriers that exist between Indigenous peoples and the justice system. It is clear, however, in the photo on the right, that more than a web page and promised words needs to happen. Thunder Bay needs reconciliation. It needs reconciliation so its Indigenous people can stop praying for change and start seeing it. And it needs reconciliation for a radically divided community to come together in cooperation and coexistence once again. And that concludes this presentation. Miigwech Bizindawiyug. Thank you for listening.